Hello again. I hope you had a chance to watch the first video in this series, the one about the male reproductive structures. Some of the things that I said in that video, some of the things we covered, will be important to know about in this one. This one is more focused on the functions of the male reproductive system, and particularly the functions as far as sexual maturity is concerned. Another thing that we did in a previous video was neuroendocrine control, and a little bit of knowledge of that will help in this one as well. So if you missed that video, go back and find it. It's in the nervous system playlist. If you missed the first one about the male reproductive structures, I'll put up a link at the end of this one so you can just click the link and go back and have a look at it. Anyway, to get started on this one, you should be able to recognize these illustrations here. This is the hypothalamus and the pituitary glands here, the epididymis and the testis there. Hypothalamus is up here. The anterior pituitary, I'll put an AP there, and posterior pituitary, I'll put a PP on that one. And the relationship between these two, you should remember that there's a blood vessel that links the anterior pituitary with the hypothalamus. Now, what happens is that the hypothalamus produces and releases chemicals. They're called releasing factors, and abbreviation for them is GNRF, stands for gonadotropic releasing factors. Now, oftentimes they're just called gonadotropic releasing hormones because they are hormones in particular. So what the hypothalamus does, it produces and releases gonadotropic releasing factors, puts them into this little blood vessel. The blood vessel takes them to the anterior pituitary. They affect the cells in the anterior pituitary and cause it to release its own hormones. And those hormones are actually the gonadotropic hormones. So the anterior pituitary releases two hormones, which are they are gonadotropic hormones. One of them is called FSH, and the other one is LH. Now I'll write those names up here. FSH is follicle stimulating hormone. And LH is luteinizing hormone. We're going to deal with that one first, luteinizing hormone. Now, it looks, by the way, I've drawn it, it looks like these things sort of drop off the bottom of the anterior pituitary. That's not true. They get put back into the circulatory system and they travel around the body and they affect the tissues which are sensitive to them. We're dealing with luteinizing hormone. The luteinizing hormone affects inside the testes. Remember, there's those interstitial cells. They're the clusters of cells which are in between the seminiferous tubules. So, interstitial cells. These cells produce and release a hormone. So what we have is a sort of a chain reaction. These hormones affect the release of these hormones. This hormone here travels through the circulatory system, gets down to the testis, and affects these cells to cause them to release their hormone, which is testosterone. Now, what I've said already is that this system doesn't kick in until puberty. So if we look at it, when the body decides, when the brain recognizes that the system is ready for maturity, the brain is sensitive to changes in the body all the time, hypothalamus is the trigger. It will release its factors which cause the release of this, which affects this, causing the release of testosterone. Testosterone gets into the blood, travels all the way around the body, and it affects the tissues which are sensitive to it. And what testosterone does is testosterone brings about the secondary sex characteristics. Now you'll remember from the first video that the maleness, the fact that a person has a penis and a testes, that's primary sex characteristics. Secondary sex characteristics are those things that happen that are associated with the maturity of the primary sex characteristics as well. So what we have is secondary sex characteristics such as muscle growth and skeletal growth, hair growth, and we're talking both pubic hair and axillary hair, which grows in the armpits. We have the larynx growth, so that's the voice deepens. Sweat glands mature in the skin. And that brings about the possibility of acne, BO, and I suppose the other one we should write down is the maturity of the primary sex characteristics. So what we have is penis growth, and the scrotum enlarges and becomes more elastic so that the testes hang further from the body wall and that sort of thing. So now we have it. There's the testosterone and what it does. This is maintained in the system because the hypothalamus, we're going to go over here and think about it now. Testosterone goes into the blood, travels around the body. The hypothalamus is sensitive to the testosterone levels. So it recognizes that the testosterone level is at a certain height or certain concentration. And should it recognize that there's a little bit lower testosterone level, it will actually increase this secretion of its releasing factor, which causes more LH, which causes more testosterone. If the testosterone level is too high, then it will actually diminish this secretion. So testosterone levels are maintained fairly consistent throughout the life of a man, as you know, all right into old age. That's a very different system, very different connection than you're going to realize with the female system, because the female hormones are not maintained at an even level. That's called negative feedback, by the way, when there's a recognition and it diminishes it if it has to, or it increases to maintain a particular level. One other thing we should mention about testosterone is not only released from the interstitial cells in the testes. Testosterone is also released from the adrenal cortex. So the adrenal gland is that gland that sits on top of the kidney, and there's a little bit of testosterone released from the cortical regions of that gland in both males and females. So females do have a testosterone level, but it doesn't necessarily do all of this, although it does have some of these effects. So there is a tendency for skeletal growth and muscle development in females and so on. So that sort of summarizes the testosterone part of this story. Let's take a look at what follicle stimulating hormone does. That's the other one. Remember, follicle stimulating hormone is released by the same sequence of events here. Hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. Here's follicle stimulating hormone here. Follicle stimulating hormone is a gonadotropic hormone. Gonadotropic hormones affect the gonads. The gonads in this case are the testes. Follicle stimulating hormone. I can get rid of this now. Follicle stimulating hormone quite simply brings about spermatogenesis. But you'll recognize that a follicle is a gamete. And In the case of males, the gamete is the sperm, and we're talking about follicle-stimulating hormone, a hormone that generates or causes the generation or the genesis, the origin of sperm. Now, sperm are produced in these seminiferous tubules. Now, if you go back and think about the other video, the seminiferous tubules were those tubules that lie in between the interstitial cells, and they all collect up in the epididymis here, and the collection of them becomes the vas deferens, right? So spermatogenesis occurs in these seminiferous tubules. Let me try and illustrate that process for you. I'm going to try and illustrate it by drawing a cross-section of a seminiferous tubule. There's the lumen. That's the center area. The center of any tube is called a lumen. The key feature here for spermatogenesis is the fact that there's a germ layer on the outside, near the outside of this tube. So it goes all the way around. It's a special layer of cells called a germ layer. Germ meaning germinate or to grow. And what happens very simply is that when follicle-stimulating hormone is present, this germ layer is activated, and the cells, which are called germ cells, a single germ cell will divide by mitosis, producing two cells. So this is the germ cell, and the product of this is the A and B spermatogonia. These are called spermatogonia. So this one, we'll call this one an A1, and we'll call this one a B1, spermatogonia. Notice this is a mitotic division, so there are 46 chromosomes here. Each of these cells has 46 chromosomes as well. We're still talking about mitosis, although in the production of sperm we do get meiosis, but this is still mitosis. The importance of this is obvious when you think about you can't use up all the germ cells. The germ cells have to remain, and this process goes on and on and on. If we, for the sake of our illustration here, we're going to say this cell becomes the sperm cell. This cell, the A spermatogonium, will replace the germ cell, because when this divides to produce those two cells, that's gone. So this cell is the new germ cell. This cell here, the B spermatogonia, becomes the primary spermocyte, or spermatocyte. So it becomes the primary spermatocyte. Sperm cell, spermatocyte. And this cell divides by meiosis. Now, if we do that, let me do it this way. That's this cell here. Meiosis, if you remember, has two sets of divisions in it. Meiosis 1 and meiosis 2, producing 4 daughter cells, which are not identical. These ones are identical. They've all got the same typical chromosomes. These ones would have 23 chromosomes in them, and they're not identical. This becomes the primary spermatocyte. These cells here are the secondary spermatocytes. And the cells at the bottom become known as spermatids. They're not sperm cells yet. They're getting closer to sperm cells. What has to happen, these cells are just undifferentiated cells with 23 chromosomes. They have to differentiate and become sperm cells. So when they differentiate, they go through a couple of changes. At first they're known as spermatozoa, then they become sperm cells, and when they mature. Quite a lengthy process and quite an involved process, and that's the reason for the existence of another type of cell. I'm going to mention it, I'll put it over here. It's a larger cell in comparison to these cells. It's known as a Sertoli cell. And Sertoli cells are present in the tissues of the seminiferous tubules. Now, if I put all of this into there, what we have is the germ cells on the outside, the spermatogonia becomes a spermatocyte, then you get the cell division, and then you get the second cell division. By the time we get down to the middle, this cell's migrating along. By the time you get down to the middle, we wind up with the spermatozoa being able to enter into the lumen of the tube. And when they do, remember the lumen of the tube collects up into the epididymis. They make their way to the epididymis and they get stored in the epididymis. The function of the Sertoli cell is to assist this development. All of these changes that take place require a lot of energy, so the cells, they're not able to get their food, take a lot of energy, a lot of oxygen, they have to have their waste taken away. These are sort of like nurse cells, if you want to think of it that way. They assist in this process by sort of looking after, making sure that these cells stay healthy. The whole process can take a couple of weeks, so it's ongoing continuously, so that there are literally millions of these sperm cells or spermatozoa produced every single day. One thing that I should mention, it goes back to the previous video as well, that this process occurs at a slightly lower than body temperature, so 34 degrees. These get stored in the epididymis and the lower part of the vas deferens, and they actually do their final maturation into sperm cells in these regions. This is outside of the body wall, so this is still less than 37 degrees. It's still around 34 degrees. So a male that's sexually mature has all of this that goes on in his body. Part of what has to happen as well is the sperm have to be released. So we have to take a minute and consider an erection and ejaculation. So let me just erase some of this and carry on with that part of it. Stimulation, sexual stimulation requires relaxation of certain muscles and redistribution of blood. Inside the penis there are erectile tissues which become engorged with blood under parasympathetic stimulation. So when parasympathetic neurons are stimulated, those blood vessels and that erectile tissue can become engorged with blood, which strengthens and enlarges the penis and makes it quite hard. When that happens, and if you think back to the anatomy, let me just re-sketch the anatomy just quickly here. If this is the bottom of the bladder and the urethra leading into the penis, what we had before is the vas deferens loops around the top of the bladder and originates down here in the testes. What happens, these are stored down here. When penis becomes erect, there's a sphincter at the bottom of the bladder which closes so urine can no longer enter the urethra, and the changed angle here does allow the sperm to travel along through here, and they pick up fluids from the glands. Now there's 3 glands. Remember, this one's the seminal vesicle. The prostate gland is at the base of the bladder, and it actually surrounds this tissue here, the prostate gland. And then there's another little gland here, which we mentioned before, is the Cowper's gland, or bulbourethral gland. What happens along the way is when there's an erection and these sperm start to move through here, they pick up fluids from these three glands. That fluid is called seminal fluid. The combination of sperm and seminal fluid equals semen. Seminal fluid is a complex fluid because it's made up of secretions from three different things here. And let me just comment on what those kinds of secretions are. The seminal vesicle, we'll do it in order. First, second, third, that's the order they get picked up in. Seminal fluid contains fluid from the seminal vesicle. The seminal vesicle secretes fructose. It secretes mucus. And it secretes prostaglandins. Prostaglandins are hormone-like chemicals. They're secreted by lots of tissues in the body. They affect the female reproductive system during sexual intercourse or following sexual intercourse. So we'll just leave that topic out for a little bit. But seminal vesicles release a fluid that contains these things. The prostate gland secretes a fluid as well, and its fluid contains citrate ions. So we have a source of food here, and we have a source of food there, citrate ions from that. The Cowper's gland contains bicarbonate ions. And the bicarbonate ions, that's a buffer. They buffer the semen at about 7.4. So semen is quite basic. Blood is around 7.3 to 7.35, 7.4. This is buffered about 7.4, which is perfect for the sperm because the sperm stay alive at a pH which is very close to body pH. Should the bicarbonate ions not get secreted properly, then the semen containing the sperm would die in the female system because the female system is quite acidic compared to the male system. So what happens when the penis becomes erect is this basic or alkaline fluid gets into the urethra, which is here, and starts to cause rhythmic contractions of the muscle, which leads to ejaculation. And following ejaculation, then the erectile tissue loses its blood supply and the penis becomes flaccid, and it's not able to become erect again for a period of time known as the refractory period. The next video in this series deals with the female structures, and that's coming up soon. Once again, the link to that video, should you have missed it, dealing with the male reproductive structures, is going to be right here in a couple of seconds, and there's a green gecko down here in a couple of seconds. Please click on it to subscribe. Thank you.